Me too. I would like to express my gratitude to the conveners of the conference, especially to Joseph Cohen, Orietta Ambrosi, and Carmelo Meazza for this kind invitation. And I'm sure that you are going to listen to some key points in Levinas' ethical proposal that you already know by heart. But my intention is to go step by step, little by little, from ethics to politics. And I hope that to get to the boiling point of ethics, which is, in my view, to be found in politics. In his 1964 essay, Violence et Métaphysique, Violence and Metaphysics, Derrida noted that Levinas, and I quote, does not seek to propose laws or moral rules, does not seek to determine a morality, but rather the essence of the ethical relation in general. End of quote. Following on from this determination, Derrida states that Levinas' takes on ethics, and I quote again, does not offer itself as a theory of ethics. What is in question then is an ethics of ethics. End of quote. And I quote again, in this case, he concludes, it is perhaps serious that this ethics of ethics can occasion neither a determined ethics nor determined laws without negating and forgetting itself. End of quote. And what follows here today relates to this self-negation or self-forgetting of Levinas' ethics. The main difficulty encountered by any survey of Levinas' ethical proposal is finding the art of the matter in the vast, tangled discourse that supports the main thesis of the primacy of ethics over ontology. On the other hand, the main opportunity of Levinasian ethics to overcome this difficulty is that each of its elements is tied to the others by the solidarity of an argument that is coherent in each of its parts. At least this is my opinion. In a rather arbitrary way, the notion of proximity with the other is chosen today, by me, as a jumping-off point. It's me that I'm being arbitrary. Proximity, the dual relationship of me and the other, is the situation around which Levinas' description of the ethical relation revolves. In order to understand the meaning of proximity against the backdrop of the primacy of ethics over ontology, the key aspect is to address is the asymmetry that defines proximity to the other. If we take asymmetry into consideration, any possible misunderstanding of ethics as a relationship between subjects that are autonomous, free, or equal, with the same rights and opportunities, is dispelled. The one-sided assignment of the duties of the ethical subject is marked by non-reciprocity. It unfolds in the presence of the indigent, the weak, in the presence of the widow and the orphan, and it happens before any moral or economic principle can intervene to share the burden of duties. An infinite responsibility, it's in the word of totality and infinity, goes with the asymmetry of the ethical relationship, a responsibility that is pushed, in Levinas' words, and I quote, of course, to the point of substitution, jusqu'à la substitution. Otherwise than being revolves entirely around the meaning of this substitution, and I quote, the overemphasis of openness is responsibility for the other to the point of substitution, where the for the other, proper to disclosure, to monstration to the other, turns into the for the other, proper to responsibility. This is the thesis of the present work. End of quote. Perhaps substitution is the key term for the argument of the primacy of ethics. Substitution is claimed to be, and I quote again, the very subjectivity of a subject, end of quote, whose identity is shattered by assignment of a responsibility from which one cannot escape. A rather lengthy footnote from Otherwise Than Being informs us that the fifth chapter entitled The Substitution was the germ of the entire work. Most of the chapter derives from a 1967 public lecture. There was the continuation of a previously held lecture entitled Proximity. Furthermore, substitution is a phenomenological key term insofar as, and I quote from Otherwise Than Being, the unicity of the ego first acquires a meaning where it is no longer a question of the ego, but of me. The subject which is not an ego, but which I am, cannot be generalized, is not a subject in general. We have moved from the ego to me, who am me, and no one else. End of quote. My exposure in proximity is such that I substitute myself for the other in his responsibilities and even in his duties, whereas the reverse does not happen. Substitution is one way, it is non-reciprocal, it concerns me, it is mine. The other side of the coin of substitution is my unicity, such that no one can replace me in any responsibility. And I quote again from Otherwise Than Being. In proximity, the other obsesses me according to the absolute asymmetry of signification of the one for the other. I substitute myself for him, whereas no one can replace me. And the substitution of the one for the other does not signify the substitution of the other for the one. End of quote. The ethical subject is described as, and I quote again very briefly, obsessed with a non-reciprocable obsession by the neighbor. Moreover, ethics is described as a bond in which the presence of the other, of the neighbor, becomes obsessive and persecutory. However, as is well known, Levinas does not mean to justify the paralysis of any initiative or action. On the contrary, the intention is to exalt the irreplaceability and unicity of the subject. Putting it in phenomenological terms, one can state that proximity ignites, and I quote again, the fission of the subject in the undividedness of its individuality, the fission of the ego unto me. End of quote. During the lecture given at the Sorbonne 1 year after Levinas' death, Derrida dwelt upon the profound bond established between welcoming and persecution. In this lecture, a question arises. How far can my responsibility in persecution go? And Levinas' answer, as we know, jusqu'à la substitution, to the point of substitution. But what does the substitution of the one for the other, which does not entail the substitution of the other for the one, mean if considered outside the steel frame, so to speak, of the personal relation between me and the other, around which the argument of the primacy of ethics revolves? What becomes my hyperbolic responsibility, as Bernasconi calls it, with respect to the others? That is, what becomes this responsibility within the frame of the plurality of the subject involved in the actual social relationship? In Levinas' own terms, as he puts it during the dialogue on thinking of the other, collected in Entre Nous, and I quote, what about humanity in its multiplicity? What about the one next to the other, the third, and along with him, or with all the others? Can that responsibility toward the other who faces me, that responds to the face of my fellow man, ignore the third party, who is also my other? Does it not also concern me? End of quote. This question dislocates the very thesis of the primacy of ethics in the space of the difficult articulation between ethics and politics. What follows attempts to point out the aporia that originates within the thesis that claims ethics to be first philosophy. Such a discourse is based on the emphasis placed on the ethical significance of human subjectivity in terms of the irremissible responsibility in the asymmetrical relationship with the others. In fact, the strategy of Levinas' ethical proposal apparently encounters an aporetic situation as soon as it is confronted with a condition where the subject finds itself among other subjects and each of the subjects aspires to obtain equity and justice for themselves. In other words, the very thesis of the primacy of ethics over ontology seems to run into a dead end when it's confronted with a plurality of actors that animate the space of politics. Seems, apparently, I would like to stress these statements. With that in mind, it is necessary for us to start over again with the vulnerability of the ethical subject. When confronted with the face of the other, I find myself deprived of my autonomy as a sovereign subject, but I still do not have a law to refer to. I find myself with no natural rights, but I am already suffering due to the open vulnus of an inexhaustible debt. I cannot escape the ethical relationship, I can only retreat into the nessus tunic of my scheme, to quote from Otherwise Than Being. The ethical meaning of dispossession of sovereignty and autonomy does not lead to annihilation. Dispossession that is not annihilation is an exceptional impotence, namely an impotence without counterpart, an impotence that is determined no longer with regard to power. According to Levinas, such impotence defines the phenomenological problem of the recurrence of ipseite, or incarnation. As explained in Notes on Meaning, the idea of the election goes along with the ethos of the irreplaceable. However, one can wonder what sense can this idea assume if the responsibility to which the irreplaceable is elected does not come with greater powers, but rather entails radical impotence. In the situation of persecution, does the subject not run the risk of ending up no longer being able to respond to responsibility and no longer able to fulfill their duties, as Blanchot pointed out in The Writing of Disaster? Is not absolute passivity, then, in danger of being absorbed within the asphyxiated order of being? Is this not, on closer inspection, a possibility of being absorbed in the asphyxiating order of being, that a possibility that has already been dictated by the hyperbole marked by responsibility pushed jusqu'à la substitution? Indeed, Levinas was well aware of such a problem, and his response was that, I quote, "The proximity of the neighbor in its trauma does not only strike up against me, but exalts and elevates me, and in the literal sense of the term, inspires me." End of quote. So, not only does the traumatic experience of being in proximity to the other dispossess me of my powers and rights, but it offers the gift of facing the infinite responsibility, the gift of answering, "Here I am," as we read in Otherwise Than Being. The subject is called upon to respond to the assigned responsibility. The inspiration is a call that always rises from the abyss of the anonymity of existence and emerges from the buzz of being. Therefore, it is no longer in the despair of the loneliness of hypostasis that the subject must simply exit from the asphyxiating order of being. The exit cracks open from elsewhere, precisely from the vulnerability of the non-phenomenon of the face of a neighbor. However, as George Agamben pinpoints, George Agamben, who really deeply knows the phenomenological tradition and also Levinas thought, the face is also the space of politics, and I quote, "space of politics. The face is a space for encounters, a space for," and I quote again, "being together of humans in similitas and simultas." And similitas, not only resemblance, but only also the understanding of the pain of the other. No? I see you, brother and sister, I see you suffering because of these similitas. And simultas, no? In order to understand, please, I need some water. You need to be with the simultas, no? You need to be in the presence together. And similitas and simultas are two key features of the political space that are opposite to the ethical determination of uniqueness and diachrony. Again, Levinas was well aware of the entanglements of ethics and politics, and in coherence with his main thesis on the primacy of ethics over ontology, he defended the reasons he considered ethics should not only be positioned before ontology, but also before politics, being firmly convinced that, I quote, "politics must be able to be checked and criticized starting from the ethical," end of quote. From Secrecy and Freedom, Ethics and Infinity. In his 2008 work entitled L'un pour l'autre, Levinas et la signification, Didier Franck discussed the difficult articulation between ethics and politics, stressing the problem that arises with Levinas' phenomenological takes on ethics, namely that the asymmetry, the unbalancing of responsibilities, could go as far as the alienation of a subject who has no rights but only duties. Frank addresses the aporia that had already been flagged in A Word of Welcome, as Derrida dwelled upon the double bind between me and the other on the one hand, and between me and the third party on the other hand. In the chapter on substitution, in otherwise than being, Levinas clarifies that, and I quote, the relationship with the third party is an incessant correction of the asymmetry of proximity, in which the face is effaced, c'est dévisage. End of quote. The relationship with the third party, who looks at me in the eye of the other, as we read in Totality and Infinity, or through the eyes of my neighbor, entails a correction of the asymmetry, since it implies justice. And this correction is incessant because it is unattainable, given my responsibility not only for my neighbor, but for all the others who populate the concrete ethical scene, namely the scene where I behave. Justice then appears d'emblée in the one for the other relationship, in the proximity with the neighbor. But justice does not impair the ethos of the replaceable. On the contrary, according to Levinas, justice always presupposes, and I quote, the surplus of my duties over my rights. To illustrate this point, it would be advantageous to include a somewhat longer than usual quotation from Otherwise Than Being, and I quote, in no way is justice a degradation of obsession, a degeneration of for the other, a diminution, a limitation of anarchic responsibility, a neutralization of the glory of the infinite, a degeneration that would be produced in the measure that for empirical reasons the initial duo would become a trio. But this but is quite charged. But the contemporaneousness of the multiple is tied about the diachrony of the two. Justice remains justice only in a society where there is no distinction between those close and those far off, but in which there also remains the impossibility of passing by the closest. The equality of all is born by my inequality, the surplus of my duties over my rights. End of quote. The emergence of an instance of justice within the ethical situation of proximity refers to a political space where the contemporaneousness of the multiple is tied about the diachrony of the two. As Joseph Cohen notes, ethics also implies a different kind of temporality than the one that comes than the one that comes with the economy of ontology. Moreover, the instance of justice calls into question precisely the pivotal notion on which the Levinasian phenomenological method relies, namely the supreme passivity, and I quote from Otherwise, the supreme, otherwise than being, supreme passivity of the irreplaceable, and another quote, the inner passivity of the designated, that passivity which is more passive than all passivity that defines the ethical subject, and without which the infinite responsibility would be meaningless. The bond established in the Levinasian phenomenological analysis of the vulnerability between irreplaceability and responsibility addresses our embodied reality. We also talked about the incarnation the past few days, and that's what it's about. And to be fully understood, our paradoxical incarnation of persecuted ethical subject cannot but refer to politics as its appropriate backdrop. If, and I quote again, political simultaneousness does not imply the diminution or limitation of anarchic responsibility and the related obsession, it nevertheless implies the compensation of asymmetry which defines the diachrony of the ethical duo. An instance of justice intervenes in a context that becomes political insofar as the plurality of the subject find themselves assigned to the simultaneity of mutual presence. Thus, with synchronicity that overrides diachrony, justice can have a chance, and the space for political action is able to restrict impotence so that we no longer have an excuse not to act. Thank you for your attention.